Welcome back. We're digging into insulin resistance, cancer, brain health, and why longevity people can get weird fast. And yeah, this is the episode where one hormone starts causing arguments everywhere. The wild part is how many diseases keep circling back to the same metabolic problem. Right, and that's the uncomfortable idea. Symptoms are loud, but the root can be quieter. So insulin is basically the hidden boss level here, right? That's the argument, and it's annoyingly elegant. Annoyingly elegant is such a dangerous phrase because it usually means the internet will make it a religion. The internet loves a single villain with a good logo. But the pregnancy example made me pause because that's not a disease state at all. Exactly. Pregnancy is a normal case where temporary insulin resistance helps growth. So the body is basically saying, I need to store energy and build a human. That sounds so noble compared to the usual your metabolism is broken story. And that distinction matters, because not all insulin resistance is the same thing. Right, one is adaptive and one is lifestyle-driven and ugly. The ugly one is the one everyone accidentally normalizes until the diagnosis lands. Gestational diabetes is basically that line getting crossed in pregnancy. And then the baby is growing inside that environment, which is kind of horrifying. Yeah, because the baby gets programmed for a high insulin world before it's even born. Which is why the intergenerational piece is so brutal. Humans really do love creating problems, and then calling them genetics later. Some of it is genetics, but a lot of it is the environment amplifying the risk. The cancer part got me too, because people usually think of cancer as separate from metabolism. That's the big mental jump here. Cancer is growth gone rogue, and insulin tells things to grow. Wait, so breast tumors can have way more insulin receptors than normal tissue? Yeah, far more, and that makes the growth signal even easier to hijack. So when obesity rises, it's not just extra fat, it's extra fuel signaling everywhere. Exactly. The whole metabolic environment shifts toward growth and away from restraint. That is such an unsexy explanation for something people want to blame on one miracle ingredient. People want villains, not pathways. Okay, but the brain stuff was maybe the most disturbing to me. It should be, because the brain is not just getting old in a vague way there. It's literally struggling to get enough fuel through the door. Right, insulin resistance blocks glucose access, and then the brain is stuck. So when people say type 3 diabetes, they mean brain insulin resistance. That's the cleaner way to say it, yes. And then ketones become the backup power source. Exactly, but only if the person is actually making them. So the brain is basically standing there like, hello, can somebody open the side door? And if nobody does, cognition starts dropping. That connection to depression and migraines was also way broader than I expected. Because the shared issue is energy availability, not just one disease label. I guess that's why the plaque theory in Alzheimer's gets such a hard pushback. Yeah, because plaques were treated like the whole story, and the whole story didn't behave. Spending billions on the wrong villain is such a medical industrial classic. What keeps coming back is that the brain is glucose-hungry and insulin-dependent. And if insulin is broken, the whole system starts underperforming. That's the fear, yes, and it's why insulin itself matters more than people think. Why do doctors still obsess over glucose if insulin is the real signal? Because glucose is easier to measure and easier to medicate, which is a very glamorous reason to be wrong. Okay, that was rude and also probably true. The cholesterol bit got even more controversial, though. You mean the idea that some of the longest-lived people have higher cholesterol? Yeah, and that completely scrambles the usual moral story around cholesterol. Because the body still needs cholesterol for mitochondria and sex hormones. Exactly, it is not just some cartoon bad guy in the bloodstream. So the real question is not, is cholesterol bad, but what is the context? Yes, and context is what medicine keeps flattening into one number. It's always one number until your life gets complicated. I did like the longevity critique because the guru world can get absurd. Absurd is polite. Some of it is just expensive cosplay with supplements. Bro, a lot of longevity content feels like people selling fear in a black turtleneck. But the fasting and autophagy connection is still real, right? Yes, but the mechanism is often insulin coming down, not magic suffering. So a ketogenic diet can sometimes mimic that without total calorie starvation. That's the idea. And it's why the conversation is more metabolic than mystical. I like that framing way more because it feels less cultish. Less cultish is a low bar, but yes, we'll take it. The real takeaway is that the healthiest long-lived humans tend to stay insulin sensitive, which makes the whole thing feel weirdly simple after all the noise. Simple but not easy, which is the annoying part. Yeah, the body never agrees to the simple part for free. If people can get one thing from this, it's that measuring insulin actually matters. And maybe not waiting until glucose is screaming for help. Exactly, because by then the problem has already been building for years. That's the part that sticks with me the most. Same, because it turns prevention into something concrete, not abstract. All right, next one we should get into the stuff people actually fight about online. Oh, I know exactly where this is going, and it's going to get messy. Episode 3 is where we get into the biggest metabolic arguments, and they are not polite. Welcome back. This episode gets into insulin as the common thread behind disease and aging. And honestly, the crazy part is how many different problems keep pointing back to it. That's what makes the whole thing feel less random and way more connected. When he says insulin is like fertilizer, that image is just impossible to forget. Yeah, because suddenly growth sounds helpful and dangerous at the same time. Exactly, and that's why pregnancy and puberty make the whole story more nuanced. Because in those moments, insulin resistance is not the villain at all. Right, the body is basically saying, we need expansion now. That distinction matters a lot, because not all insulin resistance is pathological. But most people hear insulin resistance and immediately think only bad news. Which is fair because the name sounds like your body is failing. Yet the real issue is when that temporary state becomes the default state. And then you start getting all these downstream diseases that look unrelated. Which is kind of rude, honestly, because one problem starts collecting cousins. Diabetes, fatty liver, hypertension, cancer, brain stuff, all of it piling up. The breast cancer piece hit hard, because it's not just about one tissue. He's basically saying tumors are just exploiting the same growth signal. And if insulin receptors are elevated in tumor tissue, that's not a small detail. No, it's almost offensively obvious once someone says it out loud. The body is like, you keep sending growth messages, I will overuse them. What I keep coming back to is that obesity is probably not the whole explanation. It's more like the metabolic environment around obesity that matters. Exactly, because the high insulin state is doing more than just storing fat. It's also making the wrong cells grow faster than they should. And then modern medicine often shows up and treats the headline, not the engine. That frustration runs through the whole conversation, especially with Alzheimer's. The plaque theory sounds so neat, which is probably why people loved it. Neat theories are always suspicious because biology loves being annoying. And the fact that plaque-lowering drugs did not improve cognition is a huge clue. Basically, if removing the thing does nothing, maybe the thing was never the cause. Wild concept, honestly, for half of medical research. What replaces it is much more interesting because the brain becomes insulin resistant. And then the brain is starving in the middle of plenty. That image is brutal because glucose is there but can't get in properly. So the brain starts leaning on ketones when it can. But if someone is constantly spiking insulin, ketone production never really rescues the system. That's the part that makes it feel like a silent energy crisis. And suddenly, depression, migraines, epilepsy, Parkinson's, they all look less separate. Not identical, but maybe sharing the same metabolic vulnerability. Which is why the idea of measuring insulin feels so overdue. The frustrating thing is that glucose alone can look normal for years. So people get reassured while the actual problem is quietly growing. And that's before you even get to PCOS, where the signal is already loud. Right, because PCOS often behaves like a metabolic warning light. And he's saying it can sometimes be reversed with dietary change alone. That is the kind of sentence that makes people angry in comment sections. Still, if the cause is metabolic, the intervention has to be metabolic too. The ethnicity discussion also got really interesting, because fat is not stored equally. Yeah, different groups can have different fat thresholds and different fat distribution patterns, which means two people can look similar and be metabolically very different. That's such an important point because appearance is a terrible lie detector, especially when visceral fat is the real problem, not just total body size. The subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat distinction is huge. One is more like storage, the other is more like trouble sitting on your organs. Organ squishing is a weirdly bad business model for the body. Terrible return on investment, honestly. And that connects right back to the personal fat threshold idea. Meaning once your storage capacity is full, the overflow becomes toxic, which is a much better explanation than just saying, eat less, move more. That slogan is so lazy it should probably be illegal. It's the nutritional version of telling someone to calm down. The longevity section was where he really started swinging at modern wellness culture. He basically separated actual science from the guru ecosystem. And that's a fair distinction, because a lot of longevity content is built on weak evidence. Correlation gets treated like prophecy way too often. Someone eats meat, someone dies, and suddenly a movement is born. That is exactly how internet nutrition logic works. What I liked is that he didn't dismiss fasting entirely. He just said the mechanism may be lower insulin, not some mystical purity ritual, which actually makes ketogenic dieting fit into the same framework. If insulin stays low and ketones rise, autophagy gets easier. So you do not need to worship fasting as the only path. That's probably going to annoy a few very online biohackers. But it's more elegant to say the body responds to the hormonal state. And insulin is basically the master switch in that story. The cholesterol part was the most politically annoying piece, though. Because if long-lived people often have higher cholesterol, that scrambles the usual script. We really built a whole culture around fearing one number. And he's arguing triglycerides and insulin resistance might be the more useful signal, which is uncomfortable, because those are harder to sell a simple fix around. That's the part that makes the pharmaceutical angle impossible to ignore. If your model centers drugs that lower glucose or LDL, you will naturally measure those markers. Convenient how biology keeps aligning with the business plan. Ridiculously convenient, almost suspiciously so. And then smoking enters the picture as another reminder that insulin resistance is not just about food. Cigarettes can push a healthy person toward insulin resistance in a matter of days. 4 cigarettes an hour for 3 days and the body already shifts? That is how fast the metabolic system can be nudged off balance. So the body is constantly responding to inputs, not just long-term labels. Which is why the whole episode feels like a warning against simplification. Not everything is diabetes, but diabetes logic keeps showing up everywhere. Exactly, and that's the unsettling part. We keep meeting the same mechanism wearing different disease costumes. That is a horrifyingly good way to put it. All right, let's leave it there before we start sounding too smug. Episode 3 is where the biggest metabolic fights get loud. And trust me, that one gets properly messy in the best way. Welcome back. This one gets into insulin disease and the longevity obsession. We are basically tracing how one hormone keeps showing up in wildly different disasters. And honestly, that is either elegant or deeply annoying. Yeah, because it ruins the comfort of having separate little medical boxes. Exactly, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The wild part is insulin is not the villain by default. It is supposed to help growth, storage, and repair. Right, it is like the body saying, make more, build more, hold more, which sounds great until the signal never shuts up. Then it becomes a loud roommate with no boundaries. And that is where pregnancy becomes such a useful example. Because there, insulin resistance is actually adaptive. The body is trying to grow a baby, a placenta, and extra energy reserves. So the same thing that is dangerous later can be smart in the right context. Exactly, biology loves context more than humans do. Gestational diabetes is basically that system going too far, right? Yes, it is type 2 diabetes of pregnancy when glucose can no longer stay normal. And the annoying part is people hear that and immediately blame the mother. Right, when the point is risk, biology, and prevention, not moral theater. But the baby really can get programmed by that environment? Yes, a hyperglycemic and hyperinsulinemic environment can shape the child's later risk. That is such a brutal inheritance. It is, and it makes prevention feel a lot less optional. Then the breast cancer angle gets even more interesting, because the rise in female cancer incidence may be hiding a breast cancer story. Or a detection story, which people always hate because it is boring. Boring is often true, which is incredibly rude of reality. But the metabolic angle is not boring at all. Tumors can carry far more insulin receptors than nearby normal tissue. 7 times more, which is just absurd. That is basically the cancer cell begging for growth signals. And obesity is really a proxy for the larger insulin resistance picture. Often, yes, though the deeper issue is the metabolic environment itself. So the body is not merely gaining weight, it is joining the wrong group chat. Exactly, and the cancer cells are very active in that chat. The Alzheimer's section might be the most unsettling of all, because it destroys the idea that plaques are the whole story, or even the main story, which is a big problem for decades of research. Especially when plaque-targeting drugs reduce plaques without improving cognition. That should have caused way more humility than it did. It should have, and instead people just kept polishing the same theory. The insulin side makes more sense when you frame the brain as energy-hungry. The brain needs glucose or ketones, and insulin resistance blocks glucose entry. Then, if ketones are not available, the brain runs short on fuel. And that becomes cognitive decline instead of a clean crash. Exactly. It is an energy problem wearing a neurological costume. Which is why depression, migraines, epilepsy, and Parkinson's keep getting pulled into the same orbit. They all show some version of brain glucose hypometabolism. That is such a technically polite way of saying the brain is starving. It really is science doing damage control. But the measurement problem seems huge here. It is because many systems still prioritize glucose and ignore insulin, which means you can look normal on paper and still be missing the whole issue. Exactly, normal glucose does not mean normal insulin. And that matters for skinny people too, not just obvious obesity cases. Yes, especially in some ethnic groups and in conditions like PCOS. That part always surprises people who think thin means safe. Thin is not a metabolic diagnosis. PCOS being tied to insulin resistance also makes her weight gain make more sense. It often does, and dietary changes can sometimes reverse major symptoms. That is one of those things medicine should say more loudly. Definitely, because knowledge there is not just interesting, it is actionable. The ethnic fat distribution piece is messy but important. Different groups seem to store fat in different places and with different risks, which immediately gets simplified online into terrible half-truths. Of course, because the internet loves a chart more than nuance. But the key distinction is subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat. One is the pinchable stuff, the other is the organ-hugging stuff. And visceral fat is the more dangerous one metabolically. Because it literally crowds the organs? Yes, and it becomes sick faster, so the bigger the fat cell, the sicker the fat cell. That animal study where visceral fat transfer caused insulin resistance was wild. It was because it showed the fat depot itself can drive the problem. So fat is not just sitting there being decorative. No, it is very much involved in the drama. Then the longevity obsession starts looking a little theatrical, especially when you separate actual science from guru branding. Because gurus can never really be proven wrong, which is a nice business model. That is the whole trick, isn't it? A lot of longevity advice rests on weak correlational evidence, like asking people what they eat and treating that as holy truth. Exactly, which is why loneliness and social connection often get missed. And loneliness can be more deadly than people admit. It absolutely can, and yet it does not fit neatly into supplement culture. The fasting autophagy ketosis chain is where it gets more convincing to me. Because insulin is a major brake on autophagy. So fasting works partly because insulin drops. Yes, but a ketogenic diet can also keep insulin low without caloric deprivation, which means you do not need to starve to get some of the same cellular effects. That is the big idea, and it is why ketosis is so interesting. The longest-lived humans being insulin-sensitive really ties the whole thing together. It does, and the Swedish data complicates the usual fear of cholesterol too. High cholesterol in the longest-lived people is such an uncomfortable result, which is usually how you know it deserves attention. Exactly, especially when cholesterol is tied to mitochondria and sex hormones. So maybe the whole problem is that we measure what drugs can fix. That is the cynical version, but it is hard to dismiss completely. Medicine does love a measurable target that also happens to be marketable. Yeah, it is not always a conspiracy, but it is definitely a pattern. And smoking proving it can induce insulin resistance just adds another layer. Even 4 cigarettes a day in that small study changed metabolism. Yes, which is a brutal reminder that lifestyle hits the system fast. The body really does keep receipts. It does, and the receipts all point back to insulin more often than people expect. That is probably the main punchline of this whole episode. Pretty much, Because once insulin goes sideways, everything starts talking to each other. All right, that is a very unfair amount of meaning packed into one hormone. Seriously, it is doing too much. But that is the point, and that is why the simplifications keep failing. We will leave it there before we start pretending this is neat. Episode 3 is where the biggest metabolic fights get loud. And trust me, that one gets properly messy in the best way. Welcome back. This one is about insulin disease and the longevity obsession. We are basically asking why one hormone keeps showing up everywhere, and why the body keeps acting like it forgot the memo. The weird part is pregnancy uses insulin resistance on purpose. That is the first thing people miss, because not all resistance is bad. Wait, the same thing that causes disease can also support growth? That is the body being annoyingly intelligent. A pregnant body is trying to store energy and feed two systems. So the problem is not insulin itself, it is the context. Exactly, and context is where modern medicine keeps tripping. Because if you only look at glucose, you miss the warning sign. Which is a very expensive way to miss the warning sign. Brutal, but fair. High insulin can be sitting there while glucose still looks normal. That is such a sneaky phase of the whole thing. Sneaky is the right word because the body compensates for years. And then suddenly the compensation breaks, and now it is a diagnosis. That is basically the story of chronic disease in one sentence. The cancer piece is where it gets properly uncomfortable. Breast tissue and tumor tissue can have far more insulin receptors. So insulin is basically handing growth signals to the wrong room? That is one way to say it, yes. Which makes obesity less the villain and more the amplifier. Exactly, because the deeper issue is the insulin-resistant environment. So the body is not just getting bigger, it is getting more persuadable. That is a horrifyingly good line. And the same logic shows up in Alzheimer's too. Yes, but people still keep framing Alzheimer's as just plaques. That plaque story has had a ridiculous amount of oxygen, especially when plaque reduction did not reliably improve cognition. So maybe the plaque was the shadow, not the cause. That is the point, and insulin resistance is the louder signal. The brain basically starts starving even when glucose is around, because the brain still needs the door opened properly. And if insulin is not doing its job, the brain loses fuel access, which is why ketones suddenly matter so much. Ketones become the backup system when glucose delivery is compromised. That explains why so many neurological disorders keep clustering together. Depression, migraines, epilepsy, Parkinson's, they all share that energy problem. And we keep treating each one like it lives on its own planet. That is the most irritating part, honestly. The body does not respect our departmental boundaries. Medicine loves a spreadsheet, reality does not. The longevity crowd then takes this and turns it into a whole religion, with supplements sold at premium pricing, naturally. Obviously, the temple has a checkout page. What is interesting is that fasting seems useful largely because insulin falls. So maybe the magic is not suffering, it is hormonal relief. That is a much better way to frame it. And ketogenic eating can do some of that without full fasting. Right, because insulin stays lower and ketones rise. Which is why people get so evangelical about keto. But the danger is acting like one diet solved the universe. Yes, the internet does love a new universe. The real lesson is probably metabolic flexibility, not cult behavior. The cholesterol part was the one that made me raise an eyebrow. Because the longest-lived groups do not always have low cholesterol. That really messes with the usual script. It does because cholesterol is not just a number to fear. It is part of mitochondria, hormones, and immune function. Exactly, which is why flattening it into good versus bad is lazy. Lazy medicine is still very popular medicine. Painfully popular. And then there is smoking instantly making people more insulin resistant. That study is wild because the body reacts that fast. 4 cigarettes and the system is already changing? It shows how quickly inflammation and metabolism talk to each other. So the big theme is that insulin resistance is not one disease. It is more like a common pathway into many diseases, which is why one lifestyle shift can hit a lot of targets at once. That part is actually kind of hopeful. It is because the body can change faster than people think. And maybe that is the most useful idea in all of this. Not that everything is simple, just that the root matters. All right, that is a nice place to land before we get too smug. Very important because smugness ruins metabolism somehow. Episode 3 is where the biggest metabolic fights get loud. And trust me, that one gets properly messy in the best way.